What's up, gang? Hope you're all doing well. Today, nvRanger & Co. has been contracted to head back out east to the Boston Commonwealth by Mr. House. I'm sure many of us are aware of his grandiose plans for New Vegas and humanity at large, so he wants us to get a better idea as to the locations that would potentially have surrounded the Boston Commonwealth and the roadways leading out of it. Fallout's maps are based on real-world locations, so if we want to figure out what might have been missing just over the edge of the border, we just have to look at a real map. The same goes for the roadways that exit the map. They often mimic real-world roads. Now, I've done similar inspections for New Vegas and the Capital Wasteland, and what I'm finding is that each game varies quite a bit in its accuracy. Relative to its contemporaries, New Vegas was really accurate. It uses real-world geological survey data to build its map off of, and it uses the actual roads that go in and around New Vegas. It even labels them. We can plainly see road signs and other in-game references to roads like the I-15 or Highway 95. Comparatively, the Capital Wasteland takes much more creative liberty, where you can have some locations that are pretty close to where they should be, and then other ones just stretched all over the place. To make matters worse, Bethesda intentionally left all of these green road signs blank, so you can't get an absolute idea as to what each specific road is meant to be. The Commonwealth sits somewhere in the middle, where it's a lot more consistent than the Capital Wasteland, but not quite as clear as New Vegas was. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. We can simultaneously appreciate New Vegas's attempts at accuracy and also appreciate Bethesda's mysterious, more creative takes on the cities they represent. Anyway, our goal here for Mr. House is to get an idea as to what was left just outside of Fallout 4, what didn't make the cut into the game, so we can kind of speculate and get an idea as to what would be just beyond the borders. I'm sure many of us have sat right at the edge of some open world space and looked out wondering what's out there or what could be out there. This isn't a Dr. Bosch video. I'm not looking to go explore the unrendered, unloaded spaces within this world, but we will go out and check where the roads actually go, because in Fallout 4 they actually lead quite a distance beyond the playable space. But the real idea is to go out to those spaces and then speculate and guess based on the real-world location what should have been there in terms of the missing towns, cities, airports, national parks, and so on. Then we're going to also follow those roadways and see where they lead at a longer range, so we can get an idea as to where the Commonwealth and Boston sits in the greater wasteland. And just to note, once again, we're doing a lot of speculation and guesswork on these locations because Fallout 4 isn't giving us entirely accurate data based on its map. So if you have any other thoughts or information you want to add to the conversation, please feel free. As you can see, based on our map here, we have 7 roads exiting the playable space of the Commonwealth. Most of them appear to be large highways, except for one up here that passes by Concord and Sanctuary, appears to be a smaller local road. We can see the speed limit on that one is 45 miles per hour. I think we should start down here in the bottom left-hand corner where the glowing sea is, because it speaks exactly to the point of this type of video. We can actually explore beyond what appears to be the playable borders of the game world. In fact, there are 7 locations marked beyond those borders. I also want to try and figure out what the crater of Adam is, or where this ground zero detonation for the nuclear bomb that dropped here was supposed to hit. First and foremost, I think the major roadway that is exiting the map here is supposed to be I-95. It also might be adjoining or a combination of I-95 and 24, and we can kind of figure this out based on its location relative to places like Hyde Park, Quincy, Natick, and so on. Figuring out exactly where the glowing sea is supposed to be is quite difficult, but this makes sense given its supernatural state. We need to find some more reference points to figure this out. The folk of the wiki claim to think that the crater of Adam is roughly where the town of Holliston is, and this kind of makes sense. Holliston is located southeast of Natick, Rocky Narrows, and of Lake Coquitchuit. All of those locations are roughly placed in the same area, but all of them are incorrectly placed relative to one another. We don't exactly know that this is Highway 95, but if we follow the road up to the Mass Pike interchange, we do know that this road running horizontally across the map is I-90, because I-90 is where the Massachusetts Turnpike is located. That's what Mass Pike stands for. This means that the glowing sea should roughly be in between these two roadways of the I-90 and I-95. We can also see right next to the crater of Adam are the Atlantic offices, and when we look in real life, I was able to find a location within the town of Holliston known as the Atlantic Beverage Distributors. And just to the northwest of the crater of Adam, you can see we have this small pool of water on the map, and this could very well be the Ashland Reservoir. It's a very fitting name for this region as well. The other location I was interested in over here is the Sentinel site, that strange big concrete pyramid in the middle of the glowing sea. I did find Sentinel Street down here, but nothing approximating this giant pyramid. Now, via the wiki, they say this location is based on something known as the Sentinel program, which would have used nuclear-tipped interceptor missiles in suburbs around major cities to protect them from ballistic threats, but it was cancelled because the public wasn't a fan of this idea. Interestingly enough, one of these locations was built near Boston, but it's actually on the opposite side of the city near Sharpner's Pond, so it doesn't line up for our purposes at all. Perhaps they moved its location because they thought it would fit better within the glowing sea, and I would agree. We're missing quite a few small towns. This could include Norwood, which should be sitting right here on the border of the map if this is the I-95, and it would have its own airport, but I think ultimately this is a lame explanation for what the glowing sea is. Perhaps the reason the glowing sea is set in an area that is far less dense in terms of population and infrastructure is because the US missile defense system protected Boston proper. But it's also hard to imagine that one bomb created an anomaly of an area that we haven't really seen in Fallout before. So perhaps the glowing sea is actually an extension, or rather a result of what occurred to Providence, Rhode Island, a city with a metro population of over 1.5 million people. We can see if we follow 95 out of the Boston area, we quickly run into this city, and the reason for it potentially being wiped out completely is because it's in between many major US cities on the East Coast, such as Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia. So perhaps despite being a major population center, it didn't receive the same amount of resources in terms of defense, and thus was wiped out and turned into a part of the glowing sea. The glowing sea doesn't seem to be something that formed over a single nuclear detonation. It seems to be a combination of many nuclear detonations that created this stretch of uninhabitable space. We can also see if we push beyond the game's borders that it proceeds quite far beyond the playable area, but at some point the trees that we associate with the area no longer appear. I think it's reasonable to speculate that the glowing sea extends down to Providence, Rhode Island, not just because it's a major population center, but because of its use in game. It's right at the edge of the map, and it's called the glowing sea for a reason. As you look off into the distance, you're not seeing the other side of the glowing sea. It appears to continue on for quite some distance. Let me know what you guys think, because the glowing sea is one of the most unique and mysterious locations in Fallout. But of course, I-95 continues on through Providence, Rhode Island, crosses into the state of Connecticut through the major coastal city of New Haven, and then just after that, we enter New York City. It's pretty interesting that the roadway that leads towards New York City out of Boston runs through an irradiated hellscape based on the speculation and rumors we've heard about the state of New York City. Within the Fallout timeline, by the year 2065, it's said that New York City had a population of 17 million people compared to its current number, which is a bit above 8 million. This puts the city's population in Fallout closer to that of its modern metro area population of over 20 million. Now, we know that New York City was hit worse than Boston, and some people think or speculate that the city is nothing more than a giant crater, but we also have some information that leads us away from that idea, because there is mention of derelict skyscrapers remaining from the Brotherhood of Steel who passed over New York City to get to Boston from the Capital Wasteland. So that tells you right there that it's not literally just a giant hole in the ground. To drive that point home more, we have to make note that New York City was in consideration for being the setting of Fallout 4, and the design documents were kept on it, so it would be unwise to assume that Bethesda considers this location non-existent. Like many of the members of the community have speculated, New York is in play within the Fallout universe and a potential setting for future games. Then if we go back up here to I-90, we can see that just on the other side of Lake Coquitchuit, where Natick is, we should have the pretty large town of Framingham. Instead of finding the town of Framingham, when we go to the other side of Natick up in the hills, we just find this unmarked substation where we can see super mutant behemoths and deathclaws. As for I-90, the road, it enters a tunnel, and if we use toggle clipping to enter that tunnel, we see it appears to go into some sort of hellish void. It also seems that in real life there is no mountain or tunnel that the I-90 passes through at this point, so it seems to just be a product of being the edge of the map and not wanting to show some blank flat plain that doesn't get rendered. Instead, they use mountains to sort of cut off your view of seeing far into the distance. If we go just a bit north of I-90, we can see that we have the Nuka World Transit Center and another road that exits the map right next to that location. Now, the Nuka World Transit Center does not connect to the road. In fact, it's an underground subway, at least when you get on it in the Commonwealth, and then by the time you get to Nuka World, you're on an above ground rail. This road is interesting because, like Interstate 90, it is also marked via the road signs, but we can see it's titled as the Middlesex Expressway. Now, the Middlesex Expressway could be a reference to the real-life Middlesex Turnpike, which was an early turnpike that doesn't hold nearly as much relevance as it did back in the 1800s during its creation. It's a relatively small road that runs parallel to Route 3 way up here, not very close to I-90. At least it doesn't appear to run parallel next to it like it does in-game. It also doesn't enter a tunnel like I-90 does. It actually starts climbing the mountain out of the map. And despite its naming, I don't think that this road is supposed to be the Middlesex Turnpike. In fact, I think it lines up a lot better with the Concord or Cambridge Turnpike, or maybe even Route 20. If we follow I-90 and Route 20 east, they run pretty parallel to one another, and it would eventually bring you to the town of Springfield, which is right next to Six Flags New England. The reason this is relevant is because Nuka World is likely based on this location. Nuka World takes inspiration from places like Disney World and Hershey Park, but in terms of being a geographic location, it's a lot closer to Six Flags New England, and we can see this represented in game. And when we compare it to real life, we can see the Connecticut River runs right next to Six Flags New England, and you also have Interstate 91 running next to it as well. And then when we look in game, we can see we do have something of a river running through the park. And then we also have a large overpass running next to that river as well. This means Nuka World is probably on the other side of the state of Massachusetts, meaning that train that runs from Boston to Nuka World is incredibly long. And then if we follow Highway 91 down a bit further, it will run into the towns of Hartford, Connecticut, which is the capital of the state, then into New Haven, and furthermore, New York City. We're here once again. So we can see that Nuka World is probably the closest we have been to New York City in the Fallout universe. Although I think I recall Atlantic City being an expansion for Fallout 76, so perhaps we got closer there, but I haven't played that, so I can't really speak to it. Just on this edge of the map near the exiting roadways, we should also be able to see the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge along with the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. It would be cool to see a Fallout make use of an area like this, kind of like the Glowing Sea, but instead of being in a radiated hellscape, you're wandering off into the wilderness. There's a lot less people, it doesn't require a ton of level design from the developers, but you get to explore the wilderness. It would be creepy and eerie, and maybe you could find wildlife that isn't so common throughout the rest of the map. We should also be able to see the towns of Maynard and Acton just west of Concord, and we can follow the Abernathy power pylon line out here quite far off into the distance. You can see there are a ton of these big power pylons. That's what the Abernathy farm uses to structure their home from. You can see there's a series of them that continues off into the distance, and we can find these continuing well beyond the playable area of the game. Don't worry, I'm not about to follow the power lines. That's somebody else's job. So that covers the western half of the map and what is just beyond the boundaries there, but I actually want to go back south. Now, we did do southwest where the Glowing Sea is, but we still have southeast over here. Something that's kind of interesting is that the Glowing Sea, as we talked about before, allows you to go well beyond these apparent borders here, but if you go into the wetlands, you can't even make it to those borders. The game actually stops you well before them, just after the Murkwater construction site. So in-game we have the Quincy Ruins, which is based off of real-life Quincy, and we have a series of roads extending from this area. In-game we obviously only have one here, and I'm going to assume it's actually the Pilgrim's Highway. When we look at our map here with the roads running south of Quincy, we can see we have two more reasonable options as to what this one is in-game. 3A is further to the north and stays tighter to the coastline, whereas 3, which is our Pilgrim's Highway, goes further inland. When we look at the road in-game, it's pretty clear that it's going further inland, so that's why I think it's probably Pilgrim's Highway. It seems that the wetlands right here next to Quincy are the Blue Hills Reservation, which is a 7,000-acre state park. It's not noted as such in-game though, but then when we look beyond the Blue Hills Reservation, we can see that this doesn't just turn into rural nothingness. There are a ton of little suburbs and towns that stretch well beyond into this area where we see nothing in game. This river that enters the swamps is actually the Charles River, and it's pretty accurate to what is there in game. Now, in real life, it appears to run a lot further west before going south, but this is a scaled down, condensed version of the region. Still, the river only goes about as far south as Hyde Park before cutting west, so I'm not sure what's going on here. I don't know why the Charles River is now running way further south than Hyde Park. And if we go back over towards Quincy, we should be able to see the towns of Weymouth and Hingham, and it seems that the landmass is recreated quite well in game, at least on the map, but we don't see anything in it. There's nothing represented here. It's just an empty wasteland. In fact, I'm not sure why we can see this large chunk of land, and there's a ton of stuff that would be here. For one, we would have the Fall River Expressway, which is roughly close to where the railroad runs in-game, and then we have things like the Borderland State Park, which is a pretty apt name for where it sits right around where the glowing sea is. Then we have towns like Braintree, which could have been something fun, maybe something not too dissimilar from Oasis and Harold. And then we have many other small towns. If we go further east, we'd have places like Weymouth and Hingham, and then we'd eventually run into Wampatuck State Park. I'm not sure if it would be worth the cost in resources, but I really wish that we could play in a Fallout game and look off in the distance and see something, even if we couldn't go there. In fact, especially if we couldn't go there, it would be cool to see ruins and destroyed towns or a swamp off in the distance that we can't go to. We just get to look at it and let our imaginations run wild. Beyond that, if we look in between Quincy and Spectacle Island, which are in game, we should actually have a ton more islands in this area. This isn't just one island off the coast of Boston. You have a series of islands, and Spectacle Island isn't even the largest of them. There's also a large peninsula that has the town of Hull at the end of it, and then you have Hingham and Hull Bay in between there. If we followed the Pilgrim's Highway south, we would eventually run into the town of Plymouth, not far from Boston, and this is the first town the Pilgrims settled when they came to North America. Plymouth sits right on the coast of Cape Cod Bay, and if we follow this road a little further south, we'd eventually run into Cape Cod, this massive peninsula. Both Plymouth and Cape Cod sound like massively relevant locations to the region, so it's very surprising that one, they weren't included in the map, and two, that they weren't included in some sort of DLC down the line, especially given Fallout 4 only had 2 large expansion packs for it in Far Harbor and Nuka World, whereas New Vegas had 4 expansion packs and Fallout 3 had 5. It just seems like Cape Cod and Plymouth would have been perfectly substantive in nearby locations to make DLCs out of, but perhaps they wanted to move on to Fallout 76, given it released not too long after Fallout 4. So now let's make our way up through the water, where we can see we have the Boston Airport right here in this little peninsula above it, and then if we go above that, there's another peninsula. This is Nahant, and then in-game it goes straight to Salem. In real life, in between Salem and Nahant, there's an entire peninsula with the town of Marblehead on it, but for some reason, the Bethesda developers decided to just remove this entirely. So now there's just an inlet of water in between Salem and Nahant. To continue with the strangeness, just north of Salem should be the town of Beverly. Now, if we look across the water here, we can see a landmass, and this landmass should be there as it is in real life. It's still a bit strange because Beverly is much closer to Salem than Nahant is, but we can see when we look on the map, it appears that Nahant and Salem are quite close, but we don't see any of this landmass shown on the map. In-game, it appears that Salem is this peninsula that sticks out on its own into the Atlantic, and while it does stick out into the Atlantic a bit, Marblehead is further east than it, further into the Atlantic, and Beverly should be right next to it right here. Now up here in this area in the map, we do have the Parsons State Insane Asylum and the Parsons Creamery, and in real life we have some relatively comparable locations with the Leahy Medical Center of Peabody and then the Cherry Farm Creamery. When we look at these locations relative to Salem, which is clearly in-game, they're pretty accurate. So this large overpass leaving the map could be I-95, it could be Route 1, and it could also be a combination of those roads and the Yankee Division Highway. If you were to follow the Yankee Division Highway, you would eventually get to Cape Ann, where you'd find the towns of Gloucester and Rockport. Following 95, just beyond the border of the map, we would have found Water Park, New England, which would have been a cool location to include in the game. Who doesn't want to explore some massive indoor decrepit water park? If you continue to follow 95 and Route 1 north, you'd eventually cut through the state of New Hampshire, but just a small portion near the coast, and then you would find yourself in Maine. Both of these roads, but more specifically Route 1, are going to bring you very close to Mount Desert Island, the home of Bar Harbor, which is the location Far Harbor is based on. And looking at the map here and zooming out, we can see just how far away Far Harbor is from the Commonwealth. It's significantly further away than Nuka World or even Cape Cod is. And if we take a look at Far Harbor's map in-game and go up near the Oceanarium, which is based on a real-life oceanarium, we can see that there's a bridge. Now, in-game, this bridge is destroyed, but in real life, this bridge would carry you over to the small town of Trenton. Trenton is home of the Hancock County Bar Harbor Airport. When we look off in the distance in-game, we just see a continuation of the mysteriously foggy woods. And when we're in Far Harbor, we're actually closer to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, Canada than we are to the Commonwealth. Now, our last large highway leaving the map goes between Outpost Zimonja and Ten Pines Bluff. I think this road is Interstate 93, which would be right next to Lake Quannapoet, which is a real-life lake that is also appearing in-game, and then we also have the town of Bedford, which we can perhaps see represented by the Bedford Station. Before we leave the map though, it's worth noting that right to the east of Concord, we should have a fairly large Air Force base in the Lawrence G. Hanscom Field. Now, of course, there's nothing like this that appears in-game, but we do have the Skylanes Flight 1981 wreck sitting right here in the approximate location of where this Air Force base should be. Now, there's nothing terribly interesting on the other side of the map here or beyond the borders. 93 would eventually take you into the decent-sized town of Lawrence. It would also take you to the not too far away capital of New Hampshire, Concord, and then if you continued following it beyond there, you would end up in the White Mountain National Forest. This is a large forest in the White Mountains where you can find Mount Washington, the highest peak in the northeastern US. But more importantly, 93 would carry you on to St. Johnsbury, Vermont, where you could find the Great Vermont Corn Maze. This corn maze could take you up to 4 hours to complete, so I think it's reasonable that we get a 16-hour runtime expansion pack for Fallout 4 a decade after its release. Then for our final road, which is this small road that runs next to the robotics disposal grounds, I'm going to guess that this one is Route 3. Now, we should have a series of smaller towns over here, including Burlington, Wilmington, and Tewksbury, but this would eventually take you over to the larger city of Lowell. This one just sits a bit further east along the Merrimack River with Lawrence. I'm just thinking it would be so unfortunate to be this close to a Fallout game if you lived in one of these locations and you were just on the other side of the border. This was essentially your chance to see your town get the Fallout treatment, and you'll likely never get it again. I also want to point out two missing locations. I wish we could have seen at least one of them in game. It's the Franklin Park Zoo and the Stone Zoo. We had two potential zoos we could have seen in Fallout 4, and instead we got zero. I know we got the Safari Adventures in Nuka World, but I just think a zoo in the main space of a Fallout game would be awesome to go in and out of and see a new variety of animals, potentially a unique encounter in there. In Fallout 3 and 4, we get all these old government buildings and historical landmarks, but I feel like a zoo, a water park, things like this would be a good switch up and a change from the norm. And the Franklin Park Zoo zoo is within Fallout 4's playable space. It could be there, they just decided not to include it for whatever reason. And then of course, the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington, D.C. is one of the most popular in the country. It seems very sensible to include that in the game, but unfortunately it's not there. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we need to see lions, tigers, bears, chimpanzees, and all these things running around in the zoos. It's more likely that they just would have been killed when the bombs fell, but still seeing the actual structure of the zoo and exploring it sounds pretty cool. Okay, so those are the locations and roads just beyond the Commonwealth. Again, if I missed anything you wish I would have talked about, please feel free to drop it below. If you enjoyed this inspection, pressing those buttons down below helps out nvRanger and Co. I'm off to make the long trek back to New Vegas to talk Mr. House into opening a zoo. I'll see you in the comments.